Hey, what's up? It's cute what if this side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku becomes monster. Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Todoroki Enji knew his media presence was SHT. It was a well-known fact, after all. His demeanor, his attitude, his property damage, it all coalesced into a generally bad reputation, despite being the #1 hero. While he was angry that he achieved the position this way, with All Might retiring, he was still relieved that it happened at all. However, things went from bad to worse when Shadow, his own son, turned against him and the rest of the world, to become the very thing he trained against. A villain. Enji couldn't say he was surprised. After his eldest son died, he started coming to terms with just what he was doing to his children, his own flesh, and BLD. They were scared of him, especially after he sent Rei to a mental hospital. He loved Rei once, but he could no longer stand to look at her once she marred the face of his perfect creation. None of his children were ever the same after that. And neither was he. He pushed Shadow harder than he ever had before, and he believed it was what led him to make the decision of becoming a villain. Though they must have at least tortured him a little, because there was no way he'd give in that easily. Enji wonders what those villains did to him. Unspeakable things, probably. Izuku and Shadow had just downed another hero, albeit a smaller one. Shadow savored the metallic taste of BLD on his tongue as he and Izuku shared the victim's heart. He liked the taste better than Hitoshi did. Though Hitoshi was warming up to it, there was BLD all over both boys. Shadow had a lot on his mouth, and Izuku had a lot on both his mouth and hands. The heart they shared once again gave Izuku a power boost. But it also gave him excess energy. That's why Izuku suddenly pinned Shadow to the wall of the alley they were in, with his back against the brick. Izuku shut him up with an intense KS. Shadow was surprised, but not unenthusiastic. Izuku was sloppy with the KS as his fingers made their way under Shadow's shirt. He didn't take the shirt off, but instead pulled it up enough that Shadow's pecs were showing. Izuku put his mouth around one, making Shadow let out a choked gasp. Izuku KS, SCK and bit, until the NPL was swollen. Then, he moved on to the other one. Shadow, on the other hand, was like sin. He wanted to reciprocate, but Izuku had him completely pinned with his leg in between Shadow's thighs and rubbing against his growing arcton. As Shadow attempted to move, Izuku's possessive growl stopped that action, and it only made Shadow's arcton worse. Izuku noticed this, and smiled. He held Shadow's chin in his fingers, tilting his head upwards. Izuku bit his own lip, drawing BLD. He KS'd Shadow again, with a ferocity that he hadn't had before. Shadow had no choice but to swallow the BLD pooling in his mouth. Something in Shadow's genetics changed. Soon he was biting down on Izuku's lip wound, desperate to get more BLD. Izuku heard sirens approaching, and quickly pulled Shadow's shirt down. He proceeded to grab him by said shirt, and pull him into the shadows, where the two of them disappeared. The other side of paradise, glass animals. They reappeared in Izuku's room in the League's base, where Hitoshi was waiting for them to get back. Shadow stumbled and got back up, moving in a distinctively non-human way. His heterochromic eyes were slitted, and he had a frantic, yet animalistic air about him. Hitoshi noticed this, and stood up. He walked over to where Shadow was crouched in the middle of the room. The half-and-half boy was acting off to Hitoshi, and he was slightly concerned. He went to touch his shoulder, before Izuku's hand grabbed his wrist, right as he was about to make contact. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Izuku told him. Hitoshi turned his head toward the green-haired boy. "Zuku, what did you do?" he asked. Izuku blushed red and lowered his head slightly. He said nervously. "I didn't really think about it in the moment, but, Hitoshi pinched the bridge of his nose. Izuku only dodged questions when he was being dramatic or when it was something serious. He wasn't dramatic around him in Shadow, so it was the second option. Hitoshi took a deep breath to calm himself. He knew Izuku didn't like it when those he loved were mad at him. "Izuku, it's okay, I'm not going to get mad at you." Izuku still hesitated. I got carried away and ... Well. Izuku looked down, and took a deep breath himself. "Humans can't travel by shadow." And he dodged the question again. "Great. Wait," Hitoshi thought. No, he didn't. For once, Hitoshi was speechless. "You mean to tell me that you accidentally turned Shadow into one of your kind?" Izuku was about to shrink and run away. But instead Hitoshi embraced him, digging his face into his shoulder. "It's okay, we just need to know these things before you up and do them," he told him. Funnily enough, those were the words that made Izuku cry. When Hitoshi felt tears on his neck, he panicked. No, don't cry. We'll figure something out. I promise." But that only made Izuku cry harder. That would have been worse, except for the fact that he was laughing as well. Izuku let go of the hug, wiping his tears away. He had a small, gentle smile on his face. "Thanks, Toshi, you and Shu always know how to make me feel better." Hitoshi also smiled, before giving Izuku a long KS on the lips. He pulled back, revealing bloody teeth where Izuku's lips were bloodied. Izuku made a realization after he did so. Wait, Toshi." The lavender-headed boy held up his hand. "Don't worry, I figured that's how it happened." he responded. He closed his eyes, knowing that there was no going back from this. He opened them and swallowed all the BLD that was in his mouth. The change was near instantaneous. Hitoshi's eyes grew more intense, and he lunged toward Izuku, capturing their lips together. Hitoshi was lapping up the BLD from Izuku's wound, which had reopened. The lavender-haired boy's eyes had also slitted. He pulled himself away to breathe. There was BLD and saliva dripping from his mouth. He turned and locked eyes with Shadow, who had tilted his head to look at them. There was no emotion in his eyes but hunger. It was obvious that the territorial part of them stayed, because they quickly latched onto each other when Hitoshi walked over. Shadow's crouched position turned into a mere sitting one, and the two stayed like that for more than a minute. Izuku quickly told them to stay where they were, hoping that they'd follow that command. He then sprinted out of the base and quickly found two victims. He transformed, wrapping his tail around the unsuspecting couple that was walking a few blocks over. Thank Kami it was sunset. He hurried back to the base, being very careful not to be seen. Jumping through the window of his room, Izuku saw the moment that his two boyfriends smelled the humans in his possession. They unlatched from each other's grip, not having moved at all, and they came over to Izuku. He only just set the victims down and transformed back when both boys lunged at their respective meals. Shadow and Hitoshi ate like wild animals, though Izuku supposed that he was like that too. There was no regard for causing as much pain as possible, only getting the job done. Shadow, predictably, started at the neck, draining the first victim of their BLD. His muscles rippled, and his overall physique grew. Hitoshi started at the chest cavity, ripping away chunks of flesh and muscle, digging his way towards the heart. As he went, his nails sharpened on both his hands and feet, ruining his shoes and making better leeway into the chest. Izuku was proud of them, even more so when both boys reached the heart. Shadow ripped his heart from the victim's torso with his teeth, while Hitoshi dug his fingers in and scooped the heart out. Both of them swallowed their hearts at the same time, and both of them noticeably grew and mutated. Izuku's smile was all teeth. He was ecstatic, especially when the two of them came over to him and started nuzzling him like a cat. He laughed as both of them started purring at the same time. Now, can either of you try and transform back? He asked. Shadow tried first, and succeeded in being biped again. However, there were white and red scales covering the sides of his face and arms. Hitoshi tried it next, though he didn't quite make it to where Shadow did. His legs still had an extra joint, so he crouched on them so he could look at both of his boyfriends. The scales on him were the same lavender color as his hair. Hitoshi finally was the one to say, that was ... an experience. Shadow nodded along with that statement. Izuku, did you know that would happen when we ingested your BLD? Shadow asked. Izuku stood guiltily, poking his pointer fingers together and looking down at the ground, before looking back up at Shadow. Shadow went over and gave him a kiss on the cheek. It's okay, I'm not mad. I feel, he thought about it, powerful. I feel new. So there's nothing to be worried about, Suku. Izuku felt a bit better at that statement. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I just got a little too in the moment. The three of them hugged and went on with their lives. When Hitoshi got to school, he felt like a changed person. There was more power in his system, and it showed in hero training. They were fighting Class 1B, and before the match started, he'd accidentally brushed up against the Shizaki girl. During the match against her, all he had to do was think of what he wanted her to do, and she did it. He wasn't about to expose this new power, so he made her answer one of his questions, and got her to surrender that way. It was also during his round of the match that something strange happened. Their team had just made a plan to split up, and take down the opposing team faster that way, when his teammate, Takoyami Fumikage, stopped him for a moment. A quick glance at his surroundings revealed no hidden cameras, so this conversation was private. Shinsu-sen, your essence is darker. Hitoshi froze. He couldn't know, could he, that he was no longer human. He peeped his head to the side, in a decidedly inhuman way. My essence? What do you mean? Though Takoyami's face always looked sullen, there was an air of seriousness that wasn't usually there. He means your aura. Hitoshi looked up to see Dark Shadow had emerged of their own volition. He's saying that you're different than you were before. Merely yesterday, they said. Hitoshi stood there for a moment, contemplating. Suddenly Takoyami was faced with an odd look on Hitoshi's normally expressionless face. A small smile. It wasn't a happy smile, but rather a smile that made the hair on the back of Takoyami's neck stand up. A similar feeling was generated in Dark Shadow, but much more profound. We'll talk later, Hitoshi said. And with that, he ran off to continue the exercise, leaving Takoyami frozen in place, still reeling from their confrontation. The exercise went well, with Class 1A winning against Class 1B. Soon enough, it was the end of the day and time for everyone to go home. Hitoshi walked deeper into the city of downtown Musutafu, well aware of the person on his tail. He reached an abandoned building and went inside. He stopped at a room in the center of the bottom floor. He turned around as he sensed Takoyami enter the room. So, Hitoshi started, slowly walking towards and around Takoyami. My, what was it? Essence is darker. The bird-headed boy had to constantly turn to face Hitoshi, for fear that if he was to turn his back, bad things would happen. Yes, that is correct, Takoyami answered. Suddenly, Hitoshi was up in the other boy's face, the other having not seen him move. Tell me what that's supposed to mean, and maybe I won't rip your throat out, he demanded. Takoyami looked very alarmed, and rightly so. With the Hitoshi held up a hand, his other one holding his head, as if he had a migraine. His eyes were wide as they darted around the room, looking for threats that weren't there. He was facing Takoyami again. You're not a threat. Takoyami figured he should be offended, that is, in any other circumstance. Yet he was suddenly glad, because maybe if he were a threat, he'd be dead by now. Takoyami spoke up again. Your essence and your aura are interchangeable. It represents who we are as people. Hitoshi was paying eerily close attention to him. For your essence to have changed, something major had to have happened, he finished. Something major, Hitoshi muttered. I think I know, he said sarcastically. Takoyami wondered what he meant. Suddenly, Hitoshi's eyes turned a deep magenta, almost glowing in the dark room. A wicked smile appeared on his face. He turned around and grabbed the newcomer behind him by the neck. Tsuburaba Kosei, you made a mistake coming here. Tsuburaba struggled in Hitoshi's tight grip. The lavender-haired boy squeezed tighter, until the Class 1B boy was gasping for air. Takoyami did nothing but watch, strangely enough. He wanted to see how this played out. Hitoshi slammed the boy onto the floor, creating a spider web of cracks in the tile. Takoyami's eyes widened. The lavender-haired boy was never this strong. Tsuburaba struggled to scream as his windpipe was crushed. Takoyami made to step in, but Hitoshi whipped his head around to glare at him, making him stop in his tracks. He looked like a demon of folklore. His eyes were slitted, his nails were sharp, and his teeth were fanged. Takoyami didn't stop him, even as the lavender-haired boy tore through the flesh of the boy's chest. Not even as he put the viscera in his mouth and swallowed. Not even as he continued eating through muscle and bone. Not even as he reached the heart, plucked it out, and swallowed it. Hitoshi's bones creaked and shuddered, mutating and growing until his legs gained an extra joint. His spine grew out into a tail and his body gained a metallic sheen. His face elongated into a sharp bone maw, yet his eyes stayed the same bright glowing magenta. He truly looked like a creature out of a nightmare. Takoyami's breath came out quick and shallow. The creature turned around, and the bird-headed boy could feel that he was staring death in the face. He did the only thing he could do at this point. He got down into a doji position and begged for his life. Please, he cried out, let me live. Hitoshi stopped in front of him, taller than he was in human form, and much more menacing. He walked toward Takoyami on all fours, and the other boy was frozen solid as Hitoshi sniffed his head. A deep purring sound emanated from the creature's throat, and it nuzzled against the face of Takoyami. A few tears escaped his eyes as he realized that he wasn't about to get eaten. Actually, it was more like a choked sob, which clashed with the purring sound. There he was, a cat-like monstrous creature, a very dead hero student, and him. Somehow he was still alive. That's how you changed, isn't it? He murmured. The creature kept nuzzling its head against his, not acknowledging that he said anything. So there they stayed, in a pile on the floor of an abandoned building. That's where Shadow found them. Takoyami didn't even notice his presence until he spoke. He's taken a liking to you, I guess. Takoyami whipped his head around to see the Class 1 traitor himself standing nonchalantly in a white button-up shirt and some jeans. Before the bird-headed boy could do or say anything, Shadow held up his hand. You're coming with us, whether you like it or not, so it might as well be peaceful. Takoyami could only nod his head, as they stood up to face a dark misty portal. The half-and-half boy stepped through the portal, and the hero student and creature followed. They walked into a quaint kitchen, and the first thing Takoyami saw was Shigaraki Tamura himself, no dismembered hands in sight, eating dino chicken nuggets. Not something I thought I'd see, he muttered. Shigaraki looked at him through his bangs. See something weird, birdie? Takoyami scrambled to assure him that, no, there was nothing weird to see. Thought so, he turned back around and continued eating. Shigi, have you seen Hito? Oh. Izuku had come down the stairs only to find one of Hitoshi's classmates and the boy himself in creature form. He made eye contact with Takoyami, who recognized the boy from the mall. Shadow spoke up, I found them and a dead hero student in some abandoned building. Now we just have to decide what to do with the living one. Takoyami shot him a look. Izuku just smiled brightly. Okay. That's cool. He turned to face Takoyami. So basically, you either join us or you die. He scratched his chin. Looking up, maybe we could set an example out of him. Takoyami waved his hands. I was getting ready to leave the hero course, out of fear for my own personal safety. Dark shadow emerged from him. Fumi wants to join. Don't let him fool you with his fancy talk, they said. Takoyami squawked at his quirk. Hey, why can't I be diplomatic about it? The quirk laughed at his embarrassment. He gave up, and turned to the villains who were obviously trying to hide their amusement. I just want to be granted safety if I join you. Izuku gave a smile that lit up the room. Okay. That's all you had to say. Shigaraki grimaced. How does anyone fall for that innocent act of yours? Izuku kept smiling and said, because they haven't seen what I'm like when I'm mad. Simple as that. Shigaraki shuddered violently, apparently reliving a memory. Yeah, fine, whatever. Takoyami went over to a chair to sit down and put his head in his hands. Meanwhile, Hitoshi managed to transform back in just a few minutes. I'm getting better at that, he muttered, and went to sit across from Takoyami. Hey, sorry about that freak out back there, he said. Takoyami lifted his head up and just gave a defeated look toward Hitoshi. I thought I was going to die, Shinsu, he responded. Hitoshi rubbed the back of his head and gave a sheepish look toward the bird-headed boy. Hey though, at least you didn't. That earned him a smack on the head from Shadow, who had been silent this whole time. Takoyami had a question. I couldn't help but notice that you ate the heart of Tsuburaba-sen back there, he started. Are you the soul stealer by any chance? He asked. Hitoshi blinked, before letting out a soft laugh. No, that's not me. It's actually me. Izuku interrupted from his place in another chair, raising his hand like a child in a classroom. Takoyami gawked. This guy. No wonder Shigaraki was questioning him about his facade. He definitely looked innocent, and he knew it too. They started talking about what Takoyami's role was going to be as another mole. That day ended, and another one began with the heroes losing an ally, and the villains gaining one. Unbeknownst to the League, they had one more recruit in the making. Unbeknownst to her, she was about to be pushed off the deep end. Yaoyorozu Momo was a lot of things. She was pretty. She was powerful. She worked hard. She was smart. But she was not a leader. She was not a confidant. She was not a true hero. That last one hurt. Every internship she did, every time she was mentored, it was all about being pretty and how to gain popularity. When she asked about rescuing people, she was shut down, quickly. When she asked Mr. Aizawa, she often wouldn't get an answer out of him. But she understood. He was dealing with a lot right now, and she could understand if he was struggling with his own demons. She couldn't blame him. So many from the hero course were dead, and one of them had turned against them. No one in their right mind could handle that and still come out okay. At least Shinsu had been fitting in okay. She had been worried when he came in later than the others, but he had friends, he had a boyfriend. He was okay. As vice president of the class, it was her job to help her fellow students, but in turn it never gave her time for herself. She was on her last straw, though she didn't realize it. Ironically enough, it was the Hero Public Safety Commission that did her in. She had asked them about saving people, being a hero who used her powers for the goodness of the world. It seems they didn't know the extent of her quirk until now. They didn't know that she could literally create anything if she knew the makeup of it. But now they did, and they held her down. She could no longer work on the front lines of hero work. They had her stay with support and help make gadgets and equipment. It was the opposite of what she was hoping for. She had expressed her worries with Shinsu, who everyone went to, because he was easy to talk to. He listened to her, and he didn't invalidate her worries, but rather, he did the opposite. He told her that she could do anything she put her mind to. There was a stray thought in her mind that she let slip. The Hero Commission is corrupted. I want to fix it. Shinsu had stared at her for a long moment, before replying, I could help you with that, if you'd let me. So she let him. It had been a week since that conversation, and they'd made no headway towards her idea. Shinsu would ask her odd questions. Things like, what do you think of number 2 hero, Hawks? How are you with the sight of BLD? What does the sight of it make you feel? How are your analysis skills? What does she think of Shinsu's boyfriend? She thought that last question was funny, though she did answer that he seemed sweet. Finally, another week later, Shinsu came up to her and asked her to meet him after school at an abandoned building across town. It seemed sketchy, but she knew that Shinsu wanted to help her, so she let that thought slide past. When she made her way there, she was met with Shinsu, standing next to the one and only Todoroki Shadow. She felt like she should have restrained him, should have done something, but instead she just stood, defeated. She should have known that her plans to fix the commission weren't going to be as smooth and easy as she hoped to believe. You're taking this awfully well, said the traitor. She merely shrugged her shoulders and asked them what she was doing here. To answer her, Shinsu picked up his phone and called someone. Yeah, she's here, we're ready. She couldn't have guessed that a very familiar misty black portal would appear next to them. The duo motioned for her to follow as they walked into what seemed to be a living room. Todoroki sat down on one of the couches and made himself comfortable. Shinsu did the same, leaving Momo to stand there awkwardly. Oh, you're Yaoyorozu-sen, right? She heard the voice of Shinsu's boyfriend behind her. She turned and saw him standing there in the kitchen that joined from the living room. She politely smiled at him. Yeah. I'm surprised you remembered, she said. So, Shinsu-sen said you all are here for the same cause. He stared at her for a moment, before looking over at Shinsu. You didn't tell her. The said boy shrugged his shoulders and said, I figured she would be the clue. Now Momo was confused. The clue. What clue? Then, her brain connected the dots. The traitor. The portal. She whipped around to stare at Todoroki, and then Shinsu, and then Midoriya. This is, she started to say, but Midoriya finished her thought for her. Yes, this is the League of Villains. Yaoyorozu stared at Izuku. So, you're a villain. Izuku pp his head to the side and stared at her head unblinkingly for a few uncomfortable moments. Yes, he finally answered. She turned to look at Hitoshi. "And you, Shinsu-kun," said boy nodded, before giving Shadow a kiss on the cheek. Before the girl could say anything about it, Izuku skipped over to the other boys and kissed both of them. Well, that answered that question. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was dry, and its nails were long. The person connected to the hand spoke, and out came the voice of her nightmares. "Izuku, what's another NPC doing here? I thought you were done collecting them," Shigaraki said. Yaoyorozu turned to face the S-class villain whose 4 fingers were on her shoulder, a hand that could easily kill her without a second thought. "Shigi," exclaimed Izuku, "can we keep her? Please." Shigaraki just kind of stared at Izuku for a few seconds. "You do realize that you've basically single-handedly taken full control of this organization, right?" Izuku blinked dumbly. "I have." He wondered aloud. Shigaraki took his hand off of Yaoyorozu's shoulder and used that hand to take a glass off the counter and dust it. Yaoyorozu was close enough to him to hear him murmur, "He has to be joking." She decided that now was a good time to speak up. "Hopefully, I'll join if I can fix the hero commission ... but I'm not going to involve myself any further than that." Izuku smiled at her, and Shigaraki gave her a strange look, before waving his hand out and dismissing her comment. Izuku, on the other hand, was vibrating with excitement. "Oh, this is great. Welcome aboard, Yaochin." Yaoyorozu took the nickname in stride because she figured she'd have to deal with a lot of that. Hitoshi let out a laugh, presumably at the nickname as well. "Why, yeah, Momo." Yaoyorozu turned to the very familiar voice, but there was nothing there, except for a floating t-shirt and shorts. No, it was an invisible person. Who? A sudden pain laced through her skull. She gripped her head in both hands and let out a small shriek, startling the occupants of the room. It was nothing like she'd ever felt before. It was excruciating. There was something dislodged in her brain, and the sudden spike of pain knocked it back into place. The pain suddenly stopped after a few moments, and she lifted her head to stare at the person again. "Hagakure-san?" she asked. Though it wasn't visible, Hagakure burst into tears, as was evident by her choking sobs. "Why, you remember me?" "What just happened?" Hitoshi said from his spot on the couch. Yaoyorozu started, but it took a minute for her to formulate the words. "There was something missing in my head." She looked over to Hagakure, who had stopped moving outwardly. "It was like, you, as a person," she gestured to the invisible girl, "were missing. I don't know how else to describe it." The smile on Izuku's face was wiped off. "Sounds like a memory manipulation quirk." The room started at that. Hitoshi stood up abruptly and headed over to where Hagakure was standing. He turned to face Izuku, a dark expression overtop his normal scowl. "Who would we know that has a memory manipulation quirk, and has some sort of reasoning to make people forget her?" He gestured at Hagakure, who had gone to sit at the kitchen table, head obviously in her hands. Izuku looked as if he knew exactly who had such a thing. "I may have an idea." He went and sat down across from Hagakure. There was a serious expression on his usually happy face. "Have you had any contact with All for One?" She shook her head. From the corner of his eye, he saw Shigaraki stiffen from his place against the counter. "Oi, what does this have to do with Sensei?" He was ignored. Izuku wondered, doesn't he have Ragdoll's search quirk now? Couldn't he have combined it with the memory quirk? No, not just that, he'd need to have another quirk, possibly some high-radius telekinesis, or a quirk that reaches for its target, or maybe his words dissolved into mutters that were too fast for the surrounding group to catch. Izuku stopped muttering abruptly, and he looked up at Hagakure. "I think I figured it out, but I'm going to need a few days to work around it." Hagakure jumped up, went around the table, and gave Izuku a hug. Tears dripped down onto him. The crying girl in his arms moved back after a few moments. Izuku just blinked at her, uncomprehending of what just happened. Hitoshi laughed and kissed his head, leaving a slight blush on Izuku's face. "All right, everyone, this concludes our impromptu meeting that involves half our members." Everyone got up to leave, except for Yaoyorozu. She lagged behind. Izuku waved her off. "Go home, Yaoyorozu-san. Let yourself mull it over for a night." However, he paused. Yaoyorozu couldn't help the shiver at the dark expression that crossed his face. "You do well not to not tell anyone about us, yeah?" She hastily nodded, reassuring them that yes, she won't tell anybody about them. The next day, Hitoshi decided to track down a 1B student, despite the added security personnel surrounding all the hero students. There were less excursions out of the school ever since the training camp, but that didn't mean they were non-existent. Hitoshi browsed the shops of downtown Misutafu. The streets weren't as lively as they used to be. Most of the people he passed were walking quickly. Some of them looked over their shoulders from time to time. The waves Izuku have made were visible in Japan's everyday life. However, Hitoshi wasn't just out here for a stroll. In reality, he was following someone. Class 1B's class representative, Kendo Itsuka. He called out, "Oi, Kendo." As the girl turned around, he caught up to her. "Oh, Shinsu. I didn't know you were leaving campus today too," she said. Hitoshi just rubbed his head somewhat awkwardly. "Ah, yeah. It was just last minute." They kept walking, all the while dishing out some stilted conversation, as neither of them knew each other very well. Hitoshi was only stalling for time as the day went on. This attempt lasted until the sun was about to go down. As Kendo motioned for them to start heading back, Hitoshi agreed, and they started walking. After walking about a block, Hitoshi tapped her and said, "Hey, I actually know a shortcut to the school." He pointed at a set of alleyways slightly to the left of where they were walking. Kendo had an unsure look on her face, but Hitoshi went on, "Yeah, I used to come by this part of the town at the beginning of the school year to get some school supplies I still didn't have." He ran his hand through his hair and twisted himself so that he was walking backwards in front of her. "You look like you have something on your mind," he commented. "Why don't you share with the class? I'm sure it'll do you some good to get whatever it is off your chest." Her shoulders slumped as she motioned him to lead her on. Because he turned around, she missed the smirk on his face. "It's just," she began, "I feel like we're being picked off one by one," and she paused to scan her surroundings as Hitoshi led her deeper into the maze of alleys. "I've come to the conclusion that there might be a traitor among us." She finished hesitantly, as if awaiting Hitoshi's reaction. He peered over his shoulder to look at her posture. It was scrunched together in what was obviously nervousness. He decided to question her further. "And did you have some suspects in this theory?" She bit her lip and hesitated, before blurting out her immediate thought. "I think it's that Bakugo dude. He's awful to get along with, and he doesn't seem very hero material. So it would make sense if he were the traitor." Silence. Suddenly, Hitoshi let out a bark of laughter, startling Kendo enough to bump her arm against the wall of one of the alleys. They stopped walking, and Kendo was mad that he wasn't taking her seriously. "Hey, I really do think I'm onto something here." Hitoshi's laughter never stopped as she kept trying to tell him that her reasons were completely valid. His laughter cut off abruptly, startling her into silence. There was still a smile on Hitoshi's face, yet it was different to Kendo. "Bakugo isn't a traitor to Yue." Kendo recognized the atmosphere and turned her back to Hitoshi, thinking the upcoming fight was going to be from the outside. "Turn around, Kendo." She whipped her head around to look at Hitoshi. His eyes were glowing a deep magenta that lit up the crevices of the dark alleyway. He swiftly grabbed her by the neck and pinned her to the brick wall. Her eyes were wide as she looked into his. "I think you should have been a little more careful, Kendo." He used his other hand to grab her wrist to try and prevent her from using her quirk. "Letting your feelings be known about a possible traitor and not telling it to a teacher. Talk about bad situational awareness." He gripped her neck tighter, constricting her airways just a little more. "What are you? What am I doing?" He cut her off. "I thought it'd be obvious. Although, I do find the irony of it all simply hilarious." He got up in her face, and right as he was nose to nose with her, he spoke again. "You were wondering who the Yue traitor was, and here I am. In the flesh." She started thrashing against his grip, struggling to break out of his hold. When she activated her quirk, Hitoshi butt heads with her, and that move rendered her unconscious for a brief moment. She was startled out of that state by something incredibly sharp raking through her left arm, going from inner elbow to wrist. Her screams rang out through the alleyway, but they were too secluded to attract any unwanted attention. Hitoshi made sure of that. She was desperately writhing in his chokehold, trying to do anything she could to break free and fight or run for help. She didn't remember her classmate ever being strong enough to easily push someone back. She tried SWNG at him with her good arm that he had let go of in order to damage her other arm. He swiftly dodged and slammed her head against the brick with his palm. Her vision was fuzzy, and it was all she could do to stay conscious to keep fighting her attacker. Besides all her physical pain, there was a sharp sense of betrayal that left her reeling. Hitoshi licked his lips as he punched her sternum, making her keel over onto the pavement, out of breath. He used his foot to step on her atlas bone, letting out a soft of pleasure as he felt it give way under his foot, breaking the girl's neck in the process. Once the thrashing finally ceased, Hitoshi let out a bubble of crazed laughter at the situation. He stepped on the corpse's back and crushed each vertebrae with his heel. When he finished off the tailbone, he finally bent down and enjoyed his meal that he'd been putting off in favor of torturing his victim. His eyes glowed continuously. When he had finished off her heart and felt his power grow, he took some of the her BLD and wrote his name on the wall above the corpse. Slate. Then, he stepped back to enjoy the fruits of his handiwork. A smile stayed on his face as he traveled through the shadows to get back to his dorm, as he had practiced with both of his boyfriends for this exact reason. He appeared in his room, scratched up and covered in someone else's BLD, yet he couldn't be happier with the turnout. What a funny little coincidence. He checked to make sure no one was around as he snuck to the communal bathroom to take a shower. When the water was clear of red, he went back to his room and put on some comfy clothes to wear. He sat down on his bed, pulled out his computer, and went online to search for cat videos. About an hour or two later, that's what Aizawa would find when he went to check up on everybody as his nightly routine before going to bed. The two of them would look at some cat videos together, before Aizawa would bid him goodnight. When Hitoshi woke up, he shot out of bed, got his uniform on and walked down to breakfast. The mood, yet again, was somber. Later, when they were all seated in the classroom, Aizawa came in and announced that someone went missing yesterday. This made some of the class look around to see who was missing this time. When they found everybody, they were confused. Instead of canceling classes like they usually do when someone dies or goes missing, Aizawa just tells them to get their hero costumes on and to come back to the classroom. They followed his instructions and afterwards, he told them that they were going to do a little recon, according to Aizawa. Recon for what, you may ask? It was the 1B class rep, Itsuka Kendo, that had gone missing. That statement spurred the students into action. Aizawa picked groups to search different parts of the city. Hitoshi was put in a group with Takoyami and Shaoji. The three of them were sent to the downtown area of Misutafu, about 5 blocks away from where Hitoshi knew the body was. He decided that they weren't going to be the ones to find it, just because he didn't want any lingering suspicion on him or Takoyami. It took another group of students a few hours to find her. And when they were called back to school, they found out that it was some Class 1B students that found her. Hitoshi inwardly laughed at what must have been horrified expressions. After that, classes were cancelled for the day after all. Hitoshi took that time to go back to the dorms and check on Ada, who has been unable to talk and do any hero training because of his neck. Izuku really did a number on him. He found him directing students into the common room with just his robotic hand motions and no voice. His shoulders slumped once everyone was in. And that's when Hitoshi walked over. "Hey, Ida, how you holding up?" Ida looked at him with a deadpan stare. Hitoshi responded by putting his hands up in an I surrender position. "All right, sorry. Bad question." He had to fight down the urge to smirk. "Well, I was just checking in on you. Since," he looked at the ceiling, "I know how it feels to be unable to talk." He looked back down to see Ida acknowledge his statement with a nod of his head, before turning and heading towards his room. Hitoshi followed, going to his own room to enjoy the day. Principal Nezu found this latest case fascinating. Slate was an interesting name, for that's all it could be. Quirkless stopped writing things after they stopped their name. Looking through all the latest Soul Stealer murders, there is no hint to another word, and if there was, Nezu didn't see it. Could this mean that another killer sympathized with the Soul Stealer? They found evidence of that being the case before, but it was a while ago and didn't hold the same pattern of kill scenes. While Nezu enjoyed a challenge, he preferred it if it were one that didn't sacrifice the lives of innocents. But who was this Slate? A sympathizer kill? Or a friend of Quirkless? There was nothing in the latest scene that gauged that fact. Nezu hoped that this would end soon, and he knows that everyone on the case wished that as well. He wondered how that understudy of Tsukachi's was doing. Quirkless, huh? Izuku was working in Naomasa's office, while the man himself was getting more coffee. He diligently worked on the paperwork in front of him, though he couldn't help but let his mind wander to some of the screams of his previous victims. It filled him with a lovely feeling of happiness as he did his boring daily routine. He hasn't hunted in about 2 weeks, and he was starting to feel it. He hurriedly finished up what he was doing, in order to get home quicker. Unfortunately, luck was not on his side. Initially, at least. When he was en route to his house, he was mugged. The man had come up beside him and tried to strike up a conversation. When he was unsuccessful, he pulled Izuku into a side alley with a sharp jerk of his arm. Izuku licked his lips and didn't flinch when a punch was aimed his way. Upon impact, he heard one of the man's knuckles shatter. Meanwhile, there wasn't a blemish on Izuku's face whatsoever. Now, it was Izuku's turn. He punched the man in the same place he'd been punched, and watched a couple of teeth fly out of the man's mouth. The man staggered backward and turned to run. However, Izuku caught him by the shirt, twisted his body, and flung him into the alley wall. The man's form crumpled, and spittle flew everywhere as he tried to scream but gurgled instead. Izuku's eyes had turned crimson, and he stalked toward his victim, picking the man up by the hair. The two made eye contact, before Izuku yanked to the side, breaking tendons in the man's neck, but not the bones. There was nothing but glee on Izuku's face. He savored the terror radiating from the man. He let go of the man's hair, dropping him. Then, he bent down and gorged himself on the man's dying body. Because he hadn't eaten in such a long time, he ate quickly. Yet he enjoyed the taste of human flesh on his tongue once again. Once he was finished, he separated all of the man's fingers from his hands, and did the same with his toes, just for the sake of being creative. As his form changed, he spread his wings, and flew off into the night. A few weeks later, it was July 15th. Therefore, it was Izuku's birthday. Now, Izuku never did anything for his birthday. Just because he never had any friends, and there was nothing to look forward to, except for maybe his mom making him a nice dinner. That is why he wasn't expecting it when his boyfriends threw him a surprise birthday party. Hitoshi and Shadow had been planning this for about a week and a half. Shadow had gone to the party store and gotten a lot of streamers. He'd gotten attached to the many he bought like a cat with a ball of yarn. Hitoshi laughed at him when he found him batting at the streamers and getting them all over the place. Hitoshi went out and bought the cake. It was a red, purple, green, and white cake. It was cute because it represented all their hair colors. He'd come back to the base's living room and saw that Shadow had somehow managed to set up the streamers successfully. "Nice one, Shu," he murmured. He set the cake on the counter and sat down on the couch. Shadow came from around the corner, still wrapped head to toe in streamers. "Awa, Shu," Hitoshi said to him, "see mirror." He made a gesturing motion with his hands. Shadow came over and sat on Hitoshi's lap. He untangled the streamers that were in Shadow's hair, planting chaos on his face every once in a while. This action made Shadow continuously blush, along with the fact that Hitoshi was spooning him. Even when Hitoshi finished, the two sat there for a moment, relishing in each other's company. The two of them eventually got up and kept decorating for the party. Then, people started arriving. Said people, aka a bunch of the main league members, just looked happy to have something to do. Izuku texted the group chat, saying that he'd be at the base in a minute, giving them time to round up everybody in order to do the surprise. When everyone was in position, they turned the lights off and waited. And then the door opened, revealing the distinct silhouette of Izuku. As he flicked the lights on, everyone shouted, "Surprise!" Izuku made a cute little leap. That had all of them laughing. He fumbled with what he was going to say. "The party. What's the occasion?" Dead silence. It was Magni that broke it. "Darling, please tell me you remember your own birthday. It's a special event for each and every one of us. You deserve to be celebrated, sweetheart." Cue the tears. They were happy tears, so no one tried to stop him. Everyone went back to their socializing as both boys calmed Izuku down. Once all the tears were wiped away, Izuku spoke. "Thank you so much, you guys. It really means a lot that you did all this for me." His smile was so bright it practically lit up the room. "Of course, Izuku," responded Shadow, while Hitoshi nodded in agreement. Izuku kissed both of them on the lips. "Oh, by the way," Hitoshi said, "you know Class 1B's representative." He got 2 nods of affirmation. "Yeah, I killed her." He laughed. Izuku's eyes lit up. "Oh, you did. I'm so proud of you." He gave him a hug and gave Shadow a pat on the head, making Shadow purr slightly. This surprised him more than it did the others. The rest of the night went fantastically. Izuku gushed over the cake, with all its colors. The trio forced the other league members to wear party hats for a big group picture. Everyone complied enthusiastically, except for Dabai, who only reluctantly put his on for the picture. Once the picture was taken, the party dispersed a little more. As they started to clean up, Shadow got wrapped up in streamers again. This time, Izuku was there to see it. Hitoshi gestures for Shadow to come over to the couch. Izuku sat down right next to them. Hitoshi got the streamers in Shadow's hair, while Izuku got the ones that were somehow wrapped around his body. Izuku peppered in KS alongside Hitoshi. Once they were finished with cleaning up the room, Izuku stood up jovially. "I can't thank you both enough for the wonderful party. It was such a great gift." He hugged both of them. Hitoshi put his hands on his arms and said to Izuku, "That actually wasn't your gift." He and Shadow made eye contact with each other. "Me and Shadow got you something else." Earlier, Shaoji Mezu always listened. The walls of the dorm were thin. Usually, this was a curse. Today, it was a blessing. Or so he thought. "Come on, Shadow, it's time to paint the whole town red." That ... came from Shinsu's room. "Did you mean?" Mezu scrambled up from his spot on his bed and raced upstairs to Shinsu's room. Once he was in front of the door, he only second-guessed himself after he knocked. "Shinsu-sen, may I come in?" There was some movement behind the door, some shuffling of feet, and then the door opened, revealing only a tired-looking Shinsu, and no other person. The lavender-haired boy gestured for him to come inside, and he did so, hesitantly. As he made it all the way through the door, it slammed shut behind him. He morphed one of his eyes and looked at it, only to see him. Todoroki Shadow. It wasn't a fluke then, he heard correctly. "Todoroki," he murmured, before speaking louder, "you have a lot of nerve coming back here." Said boy only smiled, his teeth a lot sharper than he remembered them being. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Shinsu pick up something metallic from his dresser. He couldn't tell what it was from the angle, but whatever it was, it couldn't be good. The only warning he got was the buildup of movement, before Shinsu moved out of his eyesight faster than he could comprehend. There was the sensation of a needle piercing his neck, and he used one of his hands to yank whatever it was out as fast as he could. Looking down at his hand, he saw that it was a syringe. He let out a shaky breath. That's what Shinsu had picked up. The liquid in the syringe was a sickly purple, probably some sort of tranquilizer. He fought down the urge to throw up. "All right, plan B, shoo." That was all he heard before he was punched in the side, hard. He couldn't tell which one of them did it, but it didn't matter, because he could hear both of them gearing up to do it again. From both sides he was swung at. He tried to dodge, but there was only so much room. His head banged against the ceiling, and it was only his arms that saved him from a direct hit to the sternum. Shinsu moved like he'd never seen him move. He was agile and quick. The shadows in the huge room grew long and with him, as they did with Todoroki. There was a similar smile on his face. Finally, after a few moments of trying to dodge their punches, Mezu finally landed a hit on one of them. It was Todoroki, but unfortunately, he didn't know what would result in that. He let out a pain sound as one of his knuckles broke on impact, whereas the traitor didn't even flinch. He clutched his broken hand, giving Shinsu an opening for another syringe to be jabbed into his neck. This time, he couldn't stop it as the strange liquid was injected into his body. Mezu could feel his eyelids drooping as the tranquilizer kicked in. There was a stinging sense of betrayal that hung in the air as he finally fell into unconsciousness. Present day, Shaoji woke up in a dimly lit room, tied to a chair. All 6 of his arms were chained back behind him. He tried to use his quirk, but the cuffs on his wrists prevented that from happening. The door opened, and in came Hitoshi. Shaoji looked up at the lavender-haired boy in trepidation. "Shinsu, what are you doing?" "Allying with the enemy." Hitoshi just walked up to him and flicked him in the forehead. "Allying with the enemy?" "No, I am the enemy," he said as he smiled something wicked. The door opened again, revealing Izuku. Shoji jerked up. Why are you letting your boyfriend do this? Izuku smiled innocently at him, before looking at Hitoshi. Can I tell him about the last one? Hitoshi nodded, which prompted Izuku to give him a small KS. He turned back to Shoji and kept up the innocent facade. Tell me, have you ever heard of Slate? He questioned. Cold sweat dripped down Shoji's neck. The villain who killed Kendo. Izuku smiled wider as the seams in his cheeks opened. Yes. He held out his hands on either side of him, in a mad gesture of insanity. Didn't my beloved Hitoshi do such a great job? Shoji jerked away from Hitoshi, who still had that wicked smile. That smile seemed more menacing to Shoji now that he knew. Izuku leaned forward and held Shoji's face in his hands, but that's not the most exciting part. He tilted his face upward. There's me, and I'm the soul stealer. Stone-cold dread filled his stomach. Shoji attempted to jerk his face out of Izuku's hands. He was successful only in creating deep lacerations where Izuku's claws dug harshly into his face. No, this couldn't be happening. He couldn't believe that Shinsu and his boyfriend. Shoji's eyes were half-lidded. The cuts on his face were bleeding profusely, with no end in sight. What about? The door opened, revealing Shadow. Me. He finished. He shut the door behind him. Walking over to Shoji, Shadow pulled on his hair, lifting his whole body up slightly, and irritating his scalp with the force. Small droplets of tear escaped his eyes from the overwhelming pain. Who he choked out. Shadow abruptly dropped him back into the seat. Inertia, he answered. He stepped out of the way and gestured to Izuku. Here's your present, Izuku. He stepped behind Shoji and put his left hand on one of the shackles that were keeping his arms pinned. Slowly but surely, the metal grew hot. The iron turned crimson, and Shadow took his hand off. Izuku clapped his hands together excitedly. Oh, this is gonna be so much fun. As he spoke, what looked like black ink dripped from the corners of the ceiling. It slowly dripped down the walls and pooled onto the floor around Shoji's chair. The air in the room suddenly got humid, as if they were in a rainforest. For Shoji, it suddenly became a lot harder to breathe. The ink stretched up, defying gravity, and shaped itself into multiple hands pulling down on different parts of the hero student's body. When the hands made contact with him, it wasn't the feeling of ink, but rather something cool and smooth. Where there weren't hands, dozens of eyes opened, and they were all staring straight at Shoji. Izuku pulled his hands upward like a puppet pulling strings. This made two of the hands grip his throat. Not enough to restrict his breathing, but enough to keep him in place. The boy was shaking in petrified terror. The pain in his body was nothing against the primal fear in the presence of an apex predator. Izuku's smile was all teeth as he manipulated his hands in the air. The hands gripping Shoji slowly morphed to spikes that impaled the boy all at once. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Izuku stepped forward and held Shoji's head in his hands once more. Yet his grip got tighter and tighter until he was crushing the hero student's head between his hands. His head split and was quickly crushed into unidentifiable gore. Except for the eyes. Izuku took those and popped them into his mouth. A sweet flavor flooded his taste buds. Shadow and Hitoshi watched the display. This was better than they could have thought of. Izuku was obviously enjoying himself, so the gift itself was a success. They waited as Izuku mauled the body completely, swallowing its heart. Interestingly enough, as he swallowed, the ink on the floor and walls shimmered in and out of view, before it snaked its way back up the walls and disappeared into the ceiling's corners like it was never there. Izuku came back over to them and hugged them both so hard that, were they human, some bones probably would have broken. He started, but both boys cut him off. No. It's your birthday, you're not cleaning this up. Said Hitoshi, that's for us to do, added in Shadow. Izuku beamed and went out of the room to curl up on the couch and take a nap. Shadow and Hitoshi cleaned up the space around the body and the mess of gore that surrounded it. When they were done, they got themselves cleaned up and went to curl up with Izuku on the couch. Uraraka Achako knew something was wrong the moment she heard a scuffle in the room above her. There was something in her mind that screamed at her to take action. Because something was very wrong. Except, she's learned from her peers before her. Never go to the site of the problem immediately. That will get you killed. So instead, she went straight to Aizawa-sensei. Achako knocked furiously on his door until he had no choice but to answer. He looked as disheveled as ever, yet there was no exhaustion in his eyes and he looked her up and down, making sure she was okay, before asking, "What is it, Uraraka?" Achako told him about what she heard, right above her room. Aizawa didn't have to look at the room chart to know that it was Shinsu's room. He ran past her and up the stairs. He gave a sharp knock on the door, before turning the handle and going inside. All he found was Shinsu reading a book, and holding his hip. The boy looked up, and looked sheepish. "Sorry, sensei, I fell and hit my hip against the corner of the desk." He gestured to said desk, "and I know that probably made a ton of noise." Aizawa let out a relieved sigh, thanking whatever gods out there that it wasn't something more serious. "It's okay, Shinsu, just be a little more careful next time." He got a nod from the boy in response. Achako managed to catch up to him just then, but Aizawa assured her it was just a minor mishap. Achako wasn't so sure, but she also wasn't going to push. As Aizawa walked back to his room, she and Shinsu made eye contact. He smiled at her, and it made her shoulders relax slightly from where they were tensed. As she walked back to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was more than the telltale thump of a body hitting the floor. There was the sound of flesh hitting flesh. These walls were thin. Achako wasn't most definitely not on Jiru's level of hearing, but even she could hear when something was amiss. Achako wouldn't forget it, that's for sure. Dabe was unsure about this. A team up with Shadow in the high end. That's understandable. But there was something different about Shadow lately. His brother changed, somehow, and Dabai doesn't like not knowing what it is. At least the both of them won't be going into the mission not knowing who the other is. Dabai told Shadow who he was a few weeks into Shadow's time at the League, so there won't be any surprise when the two of them finally confront Endeavor. Dabai let loose the high end about an hour or two ago. Both him and Shadow have been waiting for their moment to strike. When the news announced the defeat of High End, the two of them took that as their cue to signal to Kurogiri, who was on standby. They stepped out of the portal and onto a pile of rubble. There were small fires spread throughout the surrounding buildings. A few meters out was Endeavor standing on the corpse of High End. Dabai was here to retrieve its body. Shadow was here to cause carnage. A manic smile took over Shadow's face. His eyes became slitted, and his teeth sharp. His body dropped into a crouch as he waited for Dabai to make the first move. Dabai released a barrage of blue flame in Endeavor's direction. This action merely distracted the hero from his position on the Namu. Endeavor went to pursue Dabai, which gave Shadow an opening to lunge at the hero's neck. Endeavor stepped back as his disgraced prized creation lunged at him from the left. He blocked a clawed hand from hitting the nape of his neck. Wait, clawed. Endeavor whipped around and took a good look at Shadow. His creation's hands were clawed, and red and white scales covered the sides of his face. His slitted eyes glowed in ethereal light. There was a wide, demented smile on his face. What the FCK? Dabai, a few meters over, was watching Shadow and thinking the exact same thing. What in the FCK hell? He said aloud. He didn't dawdle though, and used Endeavor's frozen shock to his advantage. Shadow seemed to have thought the same thing, because he circled the hero before dashing, faster than the human eye could perceive, right into Endeavor's bubble of space. The hero tried to react with flames, but he was too slow as Shadow took a solid bite out of his shoulder. The pain, coupled with the pain of his eye, caused the hero to stumble onto his haunches momentarily, leaving him vulnerable to another attack courtesy of Dabai. The scarred villain released his torrent of flames point blank, which seared the hero's face even more. Shadow leapt back into action and finished what he started. He leapt up and tore the ligaments from the muscle of the hero's injured right arm, severing the hero's arm from his body. He hastily retreated with his prize, snacking on it as Dabai hurried to finish the fight and get out with High End as soon as possible. As he finished the arm, Shadow grew in size, transforming into the creature. As he quickly approached Endeavor, he felt a heat swelter in the left side of his throat, and a cold nip at the right side. He felt the feeling formulate, until there was a powerful burst of fire and ice being expelled from his mouth. It was a large blast that knocked Endeavor, who had just barely gotten to his feet, right over and onto his butt. It continued to make its way over him, burning his skin from the clashing temperatures. With a solid handle on the neck of High End, Dabai gestured to Shadow to follow him into a misty black portal that just appeared behind him. Shadow obliged and followed, knowing that the fight was over despite the fact that the hero wasn't dead. As he stepped into the living room of the base, he stole a look at Dabai, who wouldn't take his eyes off of him. Shadow, I've said it before and I'll say it again. What the FCK? Dabai said to him. Shadow somehow managed to look a tad sheepish, before he slowly but surely transformed back. There was BLD on his mouth and on his teeth. This is not the time, Taoya, he said, gesturing at High End. Dabai reluctantly agreed with him, and had Kurogiri transport him to the lab to drop off the Namu. Izuku came bounding in. Shoo, I saw you on TV. That was so cool. I didn't know you could do that, exclaimed Izuku. Shadow blinked slowly at him. Neither did I. Dabai chose that moment to come back from the labs, and as soon as he made eye contact with the both of them, he rounded on Izuku. What the FCK happened to Shadow? I know you had something to do with this. I'm right here, said Shadow. He was ignored. I just gave him a nice power-up, like good boyfriends do, responded Izuku. Dabai gently tugged his cheeks down in exasperation, careful not to disrupt the stitches on his face. This, he gestured to the entirety of Shadow, is not what I would consider to be a power-up. In response to that statement, Shadow gave a low warning growl. Dabai held up his hands in mock surrender, but he didn't look particularly sorry for saying it. Well, Izuku said, nothing you can do about it now. He shrugged, and gave Dabai a smug look. He took Shadow's hand and walked to their room. Over his shoulder, Shadow gave a small smile toward Dabai as he waved goodbye to him. Dabai was left there to mope around in the sheer childish innocence of his baby brother, despite the hard evidence of everything but that, merely an hour before. Toru still couldn't believe it. Someone out there, most likely the head of the organization she works for, deliberately made others forget her. It was sick. She questioned Mina about why she was unaffected. The girl merely shrugged, giving her no answer. Toru decided to do something, admittedly stupid, at least in hindsight. She walked straight into the Musutafu police station. Multiple officers looked up from what they were doing when the door opened. When they saw that it was a floating pair of clothes, it took them a second to register that it was merely an invisible person. One of the officers greeted her, asking her what she needed. She hesitated before giving them her identity. She told them about how she was in the hero class at UA, but she'd woken up one day and nobody remembered who she was. The officers were skeptical, for they had never heard of an invisible girl in class UAS Hell class. But in looking it up, they found that there was indeed an invisible girl named Hagakure Toru, which lined up with her story. Their skepticism faded, and eventually it led to her position now. An interrogation room. She had secretly hoped for something a little less professional. But alas, beggars can't be choosers. The officers sat her down, where she relayed the story of herself being captured by the League. She told as much of the truth as possible, but still withheld some incriminating information of her being the Night Stalker. The officers bought the story well enough. Yet there was a feeling of dread creeping up on her. That feeling fully manifested when the detective came in. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about this man. She knew he was the lead detective on Akatani's case, but she had forgotten any warning the young man had for him. Akatani himself came in not long after the detective, who introduced himself as Tsukachi. The man was disheveled, and he looked like he hadn't gotten a proper night of sleep for what seemed like a few months. She once again relayed the story that she had told the other officers. There were a few parts of her story where his eyes twitched, but she thought nothing of it. When Tsukachi questioned her directly about Shishida Jiroda, she lied. The League forced me to help kill him. I wanted no part in it. The detective narrowed his eyes, before writing something on his notepad. Behind him, Akatani grimaced. Tell me, Tsukachi followed up, what do you know about the Night Stalker? Toru hesitated, wiping her invisible brow. I've never heard of them. Her voice shook as she talked. One didn't need a quirk to know she was lying. I see. The detective handed his notepad over to Akatani, who read it and widened his eyes. Midoriya, take this to Sansa. Midoriya, apparently, nodded his head quickly and hurried out of the room. SHT. She was screwed. The detective focused back on her. I'd like to clarify. My quirk is called Lie Detector. It's pretty self-explanatory. SHT. She was double screwed. It was at that moment that Aizawa walked in. The following conversation was psychologically brutal, particularly on part of Toru, who hadn't remembered the intense vibe her sensei gave off. Whatever conclusion they were coming to was interrupted by a swirling black portal that appeared behind Toru. She didn't realize it, but the others did. They scrambled to keep her from the villain's clutches, but they were too late as two crusty hands yanked her backwards. As soon as the portal was there, it was gone again, leaving the interrogation room empty. Hitoshi was livid. His parents had the nerve to finally call him, only now realizing he was gone for good, as they hadn't even been aware that there was a dorm system. It's been months. That settled it. Hitoshi went back to his house the following night. He had his beanie and a black skull-themed hoodie on. He got to the door and knocked. His mother opened the door, gasped, and hurriedly tried to close it. Unfortunately for her, Hitoshi stuck his foot in the threshold, halting the door. He languidly pushed open the door, despite the fact that the woman was doing all she could to keep it closed. There was a cocky smile on Hitoshi's face. Hello, family. He made eye contact with his father, his brother, and his sister, who were sitting at the kitchen table. He roughly pushed her backward, slamming the door behind him as he walked into the entryway. He looked around in what seemed to be bitter nostalgia. Then, he whispered in his mother's ear, remember when I said I'd prove you all wrong and become a hero? Well, he let his eyes wander around the room. Before focusing back on her, things changed. She tried to run back to the rest of the family, but before she could get there, Hitoshi held his hand out and made a fist. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes falling dull. The whole table started, adopting looks of fear. Hitoshi basked in it, lifting his head up but not taking his eyes off of them. A wicked smile appeared on his face. His father stood from his spot at the table, his hands held up in a placating manner. Whatever you're doing, don't put your siblings through this. Hitoshi merely pp his head to the side, smile never fading. His eyes glowed magenta, making a slight dinging sound. His sister made a terrified sound, and it only served to make him lick his lips with a long, venom-like tongue. That got his family's attention. His brother spoke up. Nai-chan, what happened to you? Hitoshi put his opposite hand on his face in a thinking position. Let's just say that I got an upgrade. That was when his father finally showed his true colors. You freak. He pointed toward Hitoshi, whose lips turned downward for a moment. He smiled again though, and said, mostly to himself, ah, there he is. Before anyone could even think of moving, Hitoshi appeared behind his father and pushed him to the ground. The man fell with a thud, face forward on the floor. Hitoshi put a slight pressure on his father's back, not enough to do any damage, but enough to keep him in place. His siblings were frozen to their chairs. He made it so that his mother was conscious, but unable to move from her spot. A foot pressed down on the lower vertebrae of his father's spine. He let out a pain cry as the bone cracked and splintered under Hitoshi's heel. Hitoshi himself let out a small of ecstasy. While his siblings didn't hear it, his mother did. Even if his siblings didn't hear it, his obvious hard-on gave him away. Her conscience struggled harder against his control, yet he had an iron grip. His father was whimpering underneath him, and Hitoshi couldn't help but palm himself. Oh, he should have done this ages ago. He wanted them all to watch. Walking over and stepping in between his siblings, he touched both of them on the shoulder. Though still conscious, their wills fell slack. Now they really couldn't move, but they could watch and react. Oh, how the tables have turned, Hitoshi said, stepping back toward his father. He slowly broke each of his father's vertebrae, enough that the man himself either went unconscious or died, he couldn't tell. Well, if he didn't die from that, he was about to anyway. Hitoshi licked his lips again, before going down and taking a solid bite out of his father's neck. BLD spewed in all different directions, and his of pleasure was audible this time. And Nai-chan, stop it, his sister yelled. Her arms were pinned to her sides, yet she still leaned forward as if she was trying to get out of her chair. There were tears streaming down her face. She wasn't the only one crying in fear. Hitoshi crouched down, heedless of the cries of his family. He feasted on his father's body, tearing into the meat between his ribs with his teeth. His body shifted and morphed. His hands grew clawed, and his shoes were shredded as his feet grew into talons. Small spikes tore through the back of his hoodie. Not enough to tear it apart, but enough for it to be noticeable. Heedless of his family's growing cries of alarm, he dug his fingers into the left side of his father's torso. He plucked out the heart, unhinged his jaw, and dropped it in his mouth. He morphed, gaining the attributes of his creature. He turned to his remaining family members, who had turned stark white. Did any of you not for once think about me actually becoming a villain, and not expect retaliation? Hitoshi's voice was deeper and more guttural. His eyes held an intensity that they hadn't before. He grabbed his mother by the throat and proceeded to crush her windpipe, leaving her gasping for air. He let out a bout of wicked, demented laughter. His siblings grew more frantic in their movements, yet it was no use. His brother started struggling harder, right before he fell sideways out of his chair, breaking free from Hitoshi's hold. Using his momentum, he rushed forward and slammed himself into Hitoshi, knocking both of them onto the ground. Hitoshi gave a monstrous snarl in the face of his brother, if he even recognized they were siblings. Hitoshi was on top of the boy, and Hiroto, said boy, was using all his strength to push a feral Hitoshi back. Hitoshi nai, snap out of it. Hiroto screamed at him. Their mother was off to the side, grasping her deformed throat, and Hiroto knew there was no hope for her. Hitoshi kept going, and it wasn't until Tsubaki, his sister, pulled him off of Hiroto, that Hitoshi finally relented. He let his sister hold onto his waist, which didn't technically restrain him, but it was enough for him to get his bearings. His eyes, which were nearly devoid of pupils, dilated back to their normal size, though they were still slitted. He craned his head back to look at his sister, whose eyes were overflowing with tears. "SHT," Hitoshi murmured. Hiroto scrambled up from his spot on the ground, keeping his distance from Hitoshi. Said boy gently grabbed his sister's hands from his waist, and turned around to look down at her. She was still ugly crying, and he didn't waste any time wrapping her up in a hug. She stiffened, yet accepted the hug without any further action. Hitoshi pulled away after a few moments, and stood up. He went over to his dying mother, and used his foot to bash her head in. Her struggling ceased, as she finally died. There were the sounds of gagging behind him, as his siblings nearly lost their dinner. "What the hell, Hitoshi?" Hiroto told him. Hitoshi ignored him, instead opting to plunge his hand into his mother's chest, pulling out her heart, and making his siblings behind him actually lose their dinners in both the sink and the garbage can. Thankfully, both his siblings were turned away when he unhinged his jaw to drop the heart into his mouth, chewing and swallowing it. Power from the two hearts, of his own parents no less, flooded his veins, making him fully transform into his nightmarish creature. However, he didn't stay that way for long, and instead transformed back into himself, with the only attribute being the lavender scales adorning his face. He got his bearings for the moment, getting used to being bipedal again. Going over to where Hiroto was bent over the trash can, he pulled him towards him, and into a hug. Hiroto struggled for a moment, but he sensed no ill will from gesture, so he let his body relax. "Here's the deal," he started, gaining his siblings' attention. "I let you two live, and you forget that it was me that attacked you." He held up a hand, cutting off whatever the two of them were going to say. Instead, he walked toward them, KS'd them both on the forehead, and grabbed their heads with his hands. "Instead, the up-and-coming villain Slade attacked you. You couldn't see any defining features, because they had nondescript clothing on." He slowly let go of their heads. They blinked, shook their heads, and looked at each other, before focusing back on Hitoshi. They looked over at the bodies on the floor, before the both of them burst into tears again, and tackled Hitoshi in a hug. "It'll be okay," Hitoshi said. After all, his sister and brother were only 10 and 14, respectively. Hitoshi held them for a few moments longer, before he stood up, and went to the phone, calling the police. Hitoshi actually had to leave from school to visit his parents. He concocted a story where his family was having a nice meal when they were attacked by the villain Slate. Tsukachi wasn't there, so Hitoshi didn't have to watch his wording around the man. The police bought his story easily, especially when it was backed up with his two siblings. The reasoning for them not getting killed was, apparently, Slate didn't go after kids. The police were eager to put this little fact down in their mannerisms logbook for anything related to the Soul Stealer. When the news reached Aizawa, the man almost had a complete breakdown, convinced that his kids would never be safe outside of UA. In her chair, Toru fell backwards at Shigaraki's feet. The portal in front of her closed, and red eyes stared straight through her. "The hell were you thinking, dipshit?" Shigaraki snarled. 4 fingers grabbed her shirt and pulled them face to face. She'd never seen Shigaraki this angry before. It was obvious he was using all his willpower not to dust her right then and there. Shadow came in a few moments later, taking in the scene with little surprise, and moved to the kitchen to get a snack. A text from Izuku quickly changed that action. He dropped the chopsticks he was holding for his ramen and took Toru from Shigaraki's grip, squishing her cheeks together so that her face was supposedly smushed. "What the hell was going through your delicate little head?" he asked. Toru struggled in his iron grip. "Todoroki." "Wait, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," he interrupted. "You almost cost Izuku his cover." Toru continued to struggle, but quickly stopped as Shadow's canines sharpened, and he bore a snarl. His eyes glowed as he gripped her head tighter, making her skull creak under the pressure. "Stop." Todoroki looked over his shoulder at Mina, who just burst into the room. She had a distressed look on her face, and it had everything to do with Toru. "Please," she begged, "give her another chance. I'll keep her in line. She won't do anything like this again. Just, please, let her live." Shadow bore a wicked smile as he dropped Toru, letting her crumple to the ground. He turned and headed toward Mina, who was standing at the threshold of the living room and kitchen. He gripped her by the shirt. "I see then, so you want to take her place." Mina's skin turned pastel pink as she blanched. No, wait." Without hesitating, Shadow punched her in the face, sending her flying into the coffee table. The door in the kitchen opened, and in stepped Hitoshi, who had just returned from the dorms. Looking upon the scene, Hitoshi mimicked Shadow's smile. "Oh, do we finally have an unmasked traitor? I'm surprised. I thought Hawks would be the first one to crack." Hitoshi stepped by Shadow's side, having also gotten the text from Izuku in their group chat. The shadows in the room grew towards the duo, stretching and lengthening into dark masses of a liquid-like substance. Facing opposite directions, the two boys simultaneously shot forward, Shadow holding Mina by her face, and Hitoshi holding Toru by her face. Both boys punched their victim in the temple, knocking both girls out. In the background, Shigaraki whistled, "DMN. You two bodyguards work fast." When they woke up, they were back to back, and tied up in chairs. Izuku stood in front of them, suit and all, and he did not look happy. Standing behind him, making a triad formation, were Hitoshi and Shadow, looking more like bodyguards than boyfriends. "You've made a grave mistake, Hagakure Toru," Izuku said to her. "And you," he turned to Mina, "I can very well tie loose ends whenever I desire." He pointed his finger down to where she was cross-eyed trying to follow it, "and I'm giving you one last chance to not FCK it up." Before he went to untie them, he horizontally sliced deep into their foreheads, making their foreheads gush BLD. Izuku didn't rush to untie them, yet when he did, they scrambled up to treat their respective wounds. He peered over his shoulder to look at Yaoyorozu, who was standing petrified in the corner. His shark-like smile made her fidget. He walked over to her, with his two boyfriends following closely behind. There was more fear in her eyes toward Shigaraki, who was idly sitting at the bar, than Izuku, who was coming toward her. That needed to change. He gestured for her to sit at the table, while he took the seat across from her. Shadow and Hitoshi went into the living room to cuddle and watch some TV. Clasping his hands together, his smile stayed. "Yaoyorozu-san, I don't believe I've properly introduced myself." He watched her for a moment, trying to detect any uneasiness she might be feeling. "You know that I'm Shu and Toshi's boyfriend, and you know that I'm a villain. But you may be wondering, which one?" To which I will let you think about that one for a moment. To help her along, he added, "You've seen me out in plain sight, like at the mall." He rested his chin on his hand, smug. He could see the gears in her head turning. She sat there for a moment, before guessing, "Are you Slate?" Before Izuku could answer, Hitoshi piped up from the living room, "That would be me, Cupcake." The horrified look on Yaoyorozu's face was priceless. Cuddled up beside him, Shadow murmured, "Why don't you call me Cupcake?" Hitoshi just snuggled closer, "'Cause Cupcake is patronizing, darling." Shadow's cheeks heated up. Turning back to Izuku, Yaoyorozu wondered aloud, "If you have someone strong like Slate behind you, does that make you more powerful or less so?" Izuku didn't respond, instead opting to let her figure it out. "Except, Shigaraki defers to you, so you must be." She stopped, her eyes going wide. Her hand flew up to her mouth in shock. Izuku gave her a wide smile, the seams in his cheeks opening up to accommodate it. Yaoyorozu looked like she was having an existential crisis. "You're the soul stealer, aren't you?" Izuku leaned back in his chair. Bingo. Izuku didn't keep her for long after that. He let her take the time to process the information. Once she left, Izuku went over to start cuddling his boyfriends. When Hitoshi went to class the next day, he saw people questioning Mina about the bandage on her forehead and the blackening bruise on her cheek. Mina merely told people that she tripped, fell, and slammed her forehead against the edge of her desk, creating a deep cut in her forehead. For the bruise, her cheeks lit up in embarrassment as she stated that merely an hour before her forehead, she and Hitoshi were sparring and she wasn't paying attention as much as she should have. Hitoshi sat down at his desk, got out his cat-shaped erasers, and his Eraserhead-themed pencils, heedless of the stares he was getting for having supposedly punched someone so hard. He got tired of the stares after a moment, and said, "I've been training as hard as all of you. I'm not a stick anymore." That seemed to placate most of them, though Bakugo had a suspicious stare. During training that day, he and Bakugo were on opposite teams. It was a simple recon at the USJ, and Bakugo was tasked with stopping him. Whenever Hitoshi tried to get Bakugo to respond, he would only receive a silent glare in return. Well, time to bring out the big guns then. He used his voice changer to SWCH to Izuku's voice, "Kaken, stop it." He cried in his most terrified-sounding voice. That stopped him dead. The look on Bakugo's face was borderline murderous. Hitoshi let the mask drop and gave Bakugo a crooked smile, making said boy blow up the surrounding area. "You piece of..." "Gotcha," said Hitoshi. Bakugo fell limp, allowing Hitoshi to go in and out, collecting the item he was supposed to be retrieving. It was only when he got back to where the rest of the class was gathered that he let up on his control of the blonde boy. The effect was immediate. A section of the building he was previously in was obliterated, leaving only smoldering remains behind. Kirishima whistled, "You did him dirty with that one." Hitoshi merely smiled back. "I know," he responded. He was very happy with how that turned out. At the end of the exercise, Aizawa have some highlights of some of the performances. He specifically mentioned Hitoshi and Bakugo's matchup, which led to Bakugo silently brooding in the corner. When they got back to the main campus and got back in class, Hitoshi played a game. "Eeny meeny miny mo," he whispered to himself, "catch a tiger by its toe. If he hollers, let him go. My mother says to choose the very best one and you are not it." His finger landed on Jiru. He counted her out of his game. He kept doing it until there was one person left. Sato Rakido. That's unfortunate. For him, Sato Rakido loved baking. It was a well-known fact. It was also helpful considering the nature of his quirk. He loved sharing his baking with others, be it via shared recipes or baked goods. So when Shinsu bumped into him in the hallway, apologizing before asking for his chocolate chip cookie recipe, who was he to say no? They didn't run into anyone on their way up to Rakido's room, and Shinsu stayed silent for the most part. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he couldn't get rid of the chill down his spine. It was once they got into his room and started closing the door that things started to get weird. The door was fully closed before Shinsu locked it, and then crushed the metal of the lock with his bare fist. Which, what the FCK? Could I see the recipe? Right? He was supposed to be sharing his cookie recipe. He went to grab it from his binder of recipes, before he was punched in the lower spine, making his legs crumple underneath him. Sato could feel his legs go numb. Something in his spine was definitely broken. He tried to scream out in pain, but it was muffled by Hitoshi's hand on his mouth. He tried to bite down on said hand, but didn't even succeed in breaking skin. Hitoshi put his knee to Sato's neck, cutting off the boy's airways. He took his hand off Sato's mouth and used both of them to cave Sato's head in. It took some pressure, but the feeling of bone giving way under Hitoshi's hands could never get old. A MMM escaped his mouth at the feeling. He quickly ripped out the boy's heart and licked the skeletal muscle off of it, his tongue wrapped clear around the heart. He set the heart aside and feasted. As he ate, he couldn't help but notice the sugary flavor, likely due to the nature of the boy's quirk. He ripped the meat off his torso, digging his fingers in between his ribs to get the muscles out. He messily put the excess viscera in his mouth, savoring the taste. He took his time to eat his delicacy. It was sweet, like the boy's corpse was. He dug his claws into the back wall of the room, creating slanted holes that fit Sato's hands into them perfectly. He looked crucified, and Hitoshi reveled in it. He took the bloodied cookie recipe and opened the window, letting in the night air. He licked the BLD off of the laminated paper before climbing out the window and back into his room. He cleaned himself off, changed clothes, got into bed, and fell asleep. It was the next morning that things went to SHD. They were doing their daily morning head count. Sato was missing from that head count, and Jiru said she had heard Hitoshi in Sato's room the night before, leading to whispers and rumors that Hitoshi was cheating on Izuku. As if, he interrupted them with a glare, "I'd never cheat on Izuku." He huffed, "I was just getting a cookie recipe from Sato." Agreeable murmurs were heard in response. Aizawa had gone to check on Sato. Yet he was only gone for a few moments before he came back, locked eyes with Yaoyorozu, and said, "Yaoyorozu, I need a lockpicker. Could you do that for me?" The confusion increased, and Hitoshi suddenly had a very bad feeling. He whipped out his phone, texting the group chat. 3 boyfriends group chat. 8:27 am. Sleepy boy, I think I FCK up. Gremlin Bean, how? Sleepy boy, I might be caught killing one of my classmates. So if I show up at the police station, then that's why. Gremlin Bean, SHT. Sleepy boy, I'm sorry. Gremlin Bean, no. Don't be. This just means that our plans are moved forward slightly. That's all. Sleepy boy, thank you Izu lesser than 3. Zuko Light, hold up. Zuko Light, what? When Hitoshi looked up from his phone, bemused, only to find that all the class eyes were on him. What? He demanded. Do I have something on my face? The rest of the class shook their heads. That was the moment Yamada came in, frantic. Have any of you seen Shouta? The class shook their heads, no. Though Usui did speak up, saying that he went to Sato's room to check on him. Yamada rushed past them and up the stairs. He dragged Hitoshi and Jiru with him, just in case he needed to take care of Shu. They made it up the stairs, only to find Sato's door opened, and Aizawa collapsed to the floor at the threshold. Shu. Yamada ran to his side. Upon closer inspection, Aizawa was sobbing on the ground. Both Hitoshi and Jiru were at a loss for what to do. Yamada looked up to see what Aizawa was crying about, only to harshly SCK in his breath. Both the students came to see what their teacher was stuck staring at. When they saw, Hitoshi's nostrils flared at the lovely smell, and Jiru let out a small scream. The sound attracted the rest of the small class. Screams of terror filled the hallway. Aizawa would have tried to stop it if he could, but he was too broken down. Jiru's eyes landed on Hitoshi, whose nostrils were still flared, and his eyes were dilated. He was stuck staring at the hanging body of Sato. His mouth was watering. She tried to get his attention, Shinsu-sen. His eyes snapped to her with lightning speed. It was too fast. His other classmates saw it in Hitoshi too, and one of them, Uraraka specifically, spoke up. Aizawa-sensei. She had the man's attention, though he wasn't looking at her. I think something's wrong with Shinsu. That got his attention even more, so much that he looked up from where he was staring at the ground. When his eyes focused on Hitoshi, the man noticed how his fingers were curled inward. He was also stiff as if he was holding himself back. As Aizawa approached him, Hitoshi turned to look at him over his shoulder. Aizawa saw that his student's eyes were slitted. Despite knowing his cover was blown, Hitoshi still tried to save the situation. Of course there's something wrong. He shut his eyes and grit his teeth. My friend has just been killed and you expect me to be okay. He yelled. But I heard you with him last night, said Jiru. Yeah, 'cause I got a cookie recipe from him. You think I would do this? Yes. Hitoshi stared at Jiru in disbelief. Said girl huffed a breath. I know what I heard, Shinsu. He grit his teeth harder, before suddenly lunging at her, tackling her to the ground in a chokehold. There were shouts of surprise, especially at the sight of Hitoshi. He was openly snarling in Jiru's face, who struggled and stared at Hitoshi as if she were seeing him for the first time. His eyes were a bright magenta. They were glowing in the dim hallway, and they made a dinging sound when they had turned. His mouth bore fangs, and lavender scales creeped up his face, overtaking his cheeks and the sides of his forehead. Just as he was about to crush Jiru's windpipe, he was pulled off of her by Usui. Digging his hands, claws, into Usui's tongue, Hitoshi drew BLD, making her instinctively unwrap her tongue from his midsection. He landed in a slight crouch, his arms leaning forward. He turned to face Aizawa, who had turned very pale. No, he whispered, waving both his hands in front of him. No, 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 no. This can't be happening. He gripped his head as more tears came streaming down. Hitoshi gave a manic smile, his rational mind elsewhere as he stared at the misery he was causing. He gave a hysterical laugh. It was unlike anything his classmates had ever heard from him. He prepared himself to lunge at his teacher. Don't you FCK dare. The sound of Yamada's voice in such close range made Hitoshi's eardrums bleed, though they healed shortly thereafter. It stopped him though, and that gave Aizawa enough time to get his bearings and wrap the boy in his capture weapon. Erasure was activated, yet it did nothing to the writhing Hitoshi, who was slowly overpowering the capture weapon. This surprised many of his classmates, who were used to the skinny stick they had come to associate with Hitoshi. Yet his muscles bulged as he started to rip the sturdy fabric holding him in place. Finally, he broke free, using the momentum he was building to dart in the direction of the stairs. His classmates attempted to stop him, but they were unsuccessful. Hitoshi practically flew down 2 flights of stairs, and instead of going down the last 2, he escaped to the shadow in the corner of the landing, disappearing from sight, and reappeared in the league's base. Izuku prepared himself for the shitshow that was about to commence. When officers started running around the place, yelling about sending heroes to UA, he knew it had started. He was called to the Neomasa's office shortly thereafter. Neomasa sat him down, and put his hand on his shoulder, gently. Did you know? He asked softly. Izuku's eyebrows scrunched up. Know what? He played dumb. Neomasa heaved a sigh. Your boyfriend is the traitor of UA. Izuku slowly started breathing hard. He started breathing faster as he started to hyperventilate. Tears fell from his eyes, starting slowly before going into a steady stream. He made some choked noises, trying and failing to wipe the tears away. What? He choked out. Hitoshi would never do that. He hiccuped. He said he always wanted to be a hero. Neomasa sat there and listened to him. Izuku looked like he needed to get it all out. He always said he loved me. Was that a lie too? He looked towards the ground, letting the tears drip onto the tile. He guiltily looked up at Neomasa. I would sometimes tell him irrelevant things about cases. Just simple things, like, he stopped to think about it. How we were having a hard time catching this one villain. He hiccuped again. Neomasa sighed sadly and patted Izuku on the shoulder. He didn't say anything for a little while. But when he did, he said, I don't blame you for telling your boyfriend those things. We just never expected him to be a villain. Izuku gave a defeated laugh. It's just my luck, though. isn't it? He looked down at his hands, which were curled up in his lap. Life just uses me as her chew toy, doesn't she? Naomasa had nothing to say to that, knowing that some of what he said was true. Naomasa was soon called out of the office because Aizawa had showed up. Izuku followed him out of the room, wanting to see how 1A's teacher was holding up. Not well, apparently. Aizawa had the deepest bags under his eyes that he'd seen on anybody, including Hitoshi. His hair was more of a mess than it usually was. His face was worn, and his eyes themselves were puffy, as if he'd never stopped crying. He probably hadn't. Midoriya. Izuku looked up from where he was zoning out. He knew his own eyes were puffy too. Aizawa was looking at him, looking grief-stricken. Aizawa-senpai, is Hitoshi really a traitor? The disheveled man merely grunted in the affirmative, making Izuku tear up more. I gotta go, Izuku said, tears streaming down his cheeks as he rushed past the two men and out of the police station. The two of them didn't try and follow, knowing how heartbroken he probably was. As Izuku made it to about 3 blocks away, his morose expression turned gleeful and sadistic. As his tears dried up, he shadow-stepped into the league's base, where he found Hitoshi curled up asleep on the couch. He didn't try and wake him, knowing that the lavender-haired boy rarely got enough sleep as it was. He was probably exhausted from the impromptu reveal. Silently, Izuku curled up with him, gently kissed his lips, before falling into a similar slumber. When Izuku woke up, he saw that Shadow had joined the cuddle pile, though he apparently stayed awake. He groggily sat up, looked at Shadow, then back at Hitoshi, who was only just waking up. He got up and cupped Hitoshi's face in his hands. By then, Hitoshi had fully opened his eyes. He yawned, showing off sharp fangs. Izuku kissed him once his mouth closed. After letting go of him, Shadow repeated the action. Hitoshi was dazed with all the attention he was getting. What'd I do? He asked. Izuku stared at him for a moment. Remember, you accidentally revealed yourself to be the UA traitor, he reminded him. Hitoshi's eyes widened in realization, before he put his hands on his head in a sheepish manner. Sorry about that. Izuku smiled cutely at both him and Shadow. Well, my cover story is still intact. I just made up some gibberish about how you were only dating me for information, he said. Hitoshi feigned hurt by putting his hands on his chest and saying, you would think so little of me. Izuku just smirked. Here's the fun part. I want you and Shu to make an appearance together. He clapped his hands childishly. Both Shadow and Hitoshi smiled brightly at that. They clasped each other's hands and simultaneously gave Izuku a kiss. I think that's a great idea, Zuku, said Shadow. Izuku beamed. Come on, let's wreak havoc, he said as he joyously skipped away. News helicopters surrounded the two of them. They were on one of the tallest skyscrapers in downtown Tokyo. Hitoshi and Shadow were side by side, staring into the cameras that were aimed at them. Wicked smiles adorned their faces. The already recent news of the newest UA traitor had already been circling the country for a few days, and every news channel was streaming a live feed on both of them. They looked at each other and briefly kissed. Then, Shadow stretched out his right hand, spreading his fingers out. Frost gathering around his hand was everyone's only warning, before ice shot out of his hand. It traveled down the hundreds of feet of the skyscraper, impacting the street below. Many people were caught up in it, and local heroes struggled to save people stuck in the jagged ice. The second round of ice came with no warning. It trapped the heroes on the scene, and the civilians were locked in place. Shadow's gaze was down at the chaos. He looked up at the news helicopters, and held up his hand to match his gaze. Many helicopters tried to flee, yet only one stayed. That one helicopter survived the onslaught. It was obvious that this was purposeful. Hitoshi's eyes turned a bright magenta, and he faced toward the camera facing them. His smile widened, splitting his cheeks open, reminiscent of Izuku. He took a few steps backwards, before running and taking a leap onto the helicopter. The occupants of said helicopter screamed in alarm, and the terrified screams of the news crew only escalated when Hitoshi swung into the open doors. Right in front of the camera, Hitoshi grabbed a crew member and bit into their neck, making BLD spurt everywhere. His gaze directed itself onto the lens of the camera, and his smile widened. Hello, world. He grabbed a hold of the bottom of the camera, shifting it up to settle just on his bloodied face. My name's Slate, the surrounding crew gasped in horror. He dropped his hold from the camera, making the cameraman stumble to catch it. He turned towards the pilot. Hey pilot-san. The man looked startled at being addressed. Why, the man's eyes fell dull. Quickly, Hitoshi commanded, keep this helicopter in the air. Once they were in a steady state of flight, he went after the cameraman first. The man tried to use the camera as a shield, but Hitoshi only swiped it out of his hands. The camera landed in one of the seats, pointing straight towards the action. Hitoshi grabbed the man by his neck, biting into it like the last crew member. But this time, he took his time to drain the BLD from the man's body. BLD dribbled down his chin, onto his clothes, and onto the floor of the aircraft. His muscles swelled and bulged. Hitoshi let the body drop lifelessly as he moved on to the next victim. There was a woman cowering in her seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. He grabbed her by the shirt, yanking her up so that they were face to face. Hitoshi licked his lips. His long tongue swiped itself across her face, leaving a trail of saliva. She passed out, and he let her flop back into her seat. A hysterical laugh escaped him. He tore open her chest, eliciting a scream of pain from the woman. He plucked her heart out of her chest, swallowing it whole. Hitoshi's form grew, adding more weight to the helicopter. Long, razor-sharp spikes protruded from his back. A tail grew from his spine, and his legs gained a joint. He saved the pilot for last, as he was under Hitoshi's control. He gave one last look at the camera, before turning around, digging the pilot's heart out of his chest, and eating that too. His form shimmered, and as the helicopter was starting to fall, large wings erupted from Hitoshi's back. He used them to fly out of the helicopter that held the view of the world. It fell out of the sky, crashing into the jagged ice in the streets below. Hitoshi flew back to the edge of the skyscraper where Shadow was watching the show. The wide, wicked smile that Shadow held was gone, instead replaced with a small one. In the streets, the impact of each helicopter shattered not only some of Shadow's ice, but the people inside of it too. A giddy feeling surged through the both of them as they relished in the carnage. They could hear sirens heading in their direction. The heroes who weren't frozen also made their way towards them. Both boys simultaneously gave a salute before they fell backwards into the shadows. Aizawa Shouta couldn't believe his eyes. His student, Slate. There was no way any of this could be real. It was so gruesome, the way Shinsu had acted. He hoped that what he saw in the hallway of the dorm was a fluke, a trick of the eye. But it wasn't. Shinsu had drained one of the crew of their BLD. Mouth pressed to the man's throat, draining the crimson fluid from his body. His muscles had swelled, and he grew taller. He had cornered a woman, tearing out her heart just like the Soul Stealer, and had swallowed it whole. His back had arched, and spikes had gone down his back, a tail stretching from his spine. It was horrifying to watch. It got worse though. Shouta didn't know how, but it did. Shinsu had large wings erupt from his back, fully grown, as if they'd merely been lying dormant. As he had flown back to the skyscraper he and Todoroki were standing on, Shouta had to watch as the helicopter fell from the sky, the feed cutting off as it made impact on the ice. He was so evil. How could Shouta have not seen it before? There had been no disgust in his face, not in his actions. There was instead a look of twisted, demented pleasure. This can't have been the same Shinsu that transferred into the hero course. Something had changed. According to Tsukachi's understudy, Shinsu's former boyfriend, Shinsu didn't show any signs of being sadistic. Shouta narrowed his eyes. Could it be possible that Midoriya lied? No, because that would mean he fooled Tsukachi's quirk, and Aizawa lurched from his spot on the couch, wringing his hands together in a fit of nervous energy. He started pacing back and forth, mumbling under his breath. If Midoriya somehow got around Tsukachi, there are other little facts he could have dodged. He hadn't been around Midoriya very much, so he couldn't say anything about his wording around the detective. But still, Shouta thought, it was still a peculiar coincidence that Midoriya was friends with both UA traitors before they turned traitor. Shouta stopped pacing. If Midoriya were actually a villain, what danger level would he be, to be friends with two powerful villains? The kid was quirkless, but that didn't necessarily make him weak. He was smart though. He was probably some sort of informant then. He needed to take these thoughts to the detective himself. When Aizawa entered Naomasa's office, Izuku couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. He was requested to leave the office, which he found rather suspicious. His suspicion only increased when Aizawa side-eyed him on his way out at the door. He walked around the station, warmly greeting his coworkers, and awaiting the possible shitshow. It honestly didn't take long for Naomasa's door to open, revealing Aizawa, whose face showed no emotion. Izuku didn't have time to ask them anything before he was wrapped in the scruffy man's capture weapon. Naomasa stepped out of the office, eyes zeroing in on Izuku. His expression was also carefully blank. Izuku chuckled nervously. Masa-kun, what's happening? Is there something wrong? Naomasa stared at him for a moment, contemplating. That depends, Izuku-kun. What a cryptic answer. Izuku waited for him to elaborate. When he didn't, he tilted his head, made his eyes seem a little bigger, and responded, depends on what? He could see Naomasa's defenses dwindling, but not enough. Naomasa got a little closer to Izuku, despite Aizawa warning him not to. The detective sighed loudly, conveying his deep-set exhaustion. Is it true? Are you a villain, Izuku-kun? Izuku's eyes welled up with tears. A villain. Masa-kun, why would you answer the question, Izuku? He interrupted. Izuku made tears stream down his face. I don't understand. Answer the question. Izuku stopped, and his expression changed. His tears immediately dried up, and his face changed into an expression Naomasa had never seen on his understudy's face before. His head was lowered, yet his eyes remained on the detective. A small smile graced his face, yet it was off-putting rather than reassuring. No. Lie. Naomasa faltered. That was a lie, he shakily said. Aizawa's grip on Izuku tightened, and Izuku's dark smile only widened. So I was right, Aizawa said, under his breath. Louder he said, we know you're an informant to the League of Villains. This surprised Izuku. He threw his head back and laughed, delighted. Informant. You think that he was overcome with giggles. They grew slightly more manic as they went on. Perturbed, Naomasa asked the question. So you're not an informant. The detective and Aizawa exchanged a look. Izuku merely let his smile widen. Naomasa watched in horror as seams appeared in Izuku's cheeks, letting his smile widen to a frightening degree. That meant he wasn't quirkless. Naomasa couldn't take it anymore. Please. Just tell us, and maybe you'll even get a lighter sentence if you cooperate. Izuku snorted, amused. Doubtful. He quickly broke free of Aizawa's capture weapon, landing on the receptionist's counter as he leapt back, startling the woman sitting there. His smile never wavered. He held out his hands, letting the shadows of the room fall under his control. He made the shadows creep up and take hold of the two men. Each of them struggled within their new prison. Panic overwhelmed their senses, and they wondered just what the hell they were dealing WTH. Izuku languidly stepped off the desk, making his way toward them. I'm not a mere informant. Shu and Toshi are my boyfriends, and they defer to me. Naomasa shrank back. Aizawa stood his ground. Izuku abruptly turned around, walking out of the station and into the parking lot. Pulling out his phone, he texted Shouto and Hitoshi. 10:38 am. Gremlin Bean, it's time, darlings. Sleepy boy, I'm there. Zuko light, so am I. Izuku smiled as both his boyfriends appeared out of the shadows. They stood on either side of him. Shouto on his right, Hitoshi on his left. Once he dragged Naomasa and Aizawa out of the station, he started his show. The five of them didn't attract much attention considering their location. Aizawa was struggling emotionally at the sight of his two former students. Hitoshi, especially. Said boy smiled wickedly, showing all his teeth. At the snap of his fingers, Izuku's plain outfit transformed into a suit. He looked the part for his impromptu reveal. Izuku turned to his boyfriends. They thought I was a mere informant for the league, he told them. Shouto couldn't hide his small chuckle, while Hitoshi snorted. Well, you definitely ain't an informant, Zuku, Hitoshi said. Well, who are you, then? Naomasa snapped, losing his patience. He struggled within his shadow prison, but was still unable to move. Izuku held his hand up to his chest, a smirk etched onto his face. Well, since you asked so nicely, he started. He held up both his hands, palms facing upwards, as he finally said it. I am Quirkless, the Soul Stealer. He couldn't keep his cackle in at the brief incomprehension on the two men's faces. It was Naomasa who cracked first. He promptly choked on his own spit, coughing and hacking. Tears dripped down his face, one by one, and he stared at the ground with glassy eyes. Those tears dripped on the ground, staining the pavement. Aizawa couldn't breathe. His lungs had stopped working momentarily as he comprehended the literal monster in front of them. It was subtle, but he started to hyperventilate. Struggling to calm himself down, he bent his head to keep the three of them from seeing his face. I'm my own FCK understudy, Naomasa murmured. Izuku used his childlike voice, an innocent face, Masa-kun. The man shrank back, and thus got to see the entire view of Izuku's eyes turning crimson. He had to watch as his own understudy's body stretched and morphed into the creature he sees in his nightmares. As Izuku grew bigger, more and more people around him started to take notice. They gasped and pointed. Naomasa tried to scream at them to run, but his voice failed him. The abomination continued to grow, its arms lengthening and its legs gaining a joint. Its maw lengthened into sharp bone, only to be overshadowed by the long, razor-sharp teeth. There was nothing to lie about here. The creature, Quirkless, chittered next to both men's ears. I got lonely, you know. And my two boyfriends needed a power-up, so I gave them one. Not my fault you don't like it. Aizawa SCK in a long, harsh breath, slowly realizing what he was hearing. You corrupted them, he whispered. His eyes went to Hitoshi, who licked his lips with a long tongue, similar to what he did in the helicopter. His eyes were a bright magenta, and Aizawa couldn't take it anymore. Despite his dry eyes, he started crying. His grief shook him. Hitoshi could have been his son. It had slowly started to feel like that for all his childer students. As the two men's psyche is finally shattered, the police station behind them finally started to realize what dire situation was happening right outside their doors. Civilians gathered to stare. Officers were scrambling out of their chairs to grab their equipment. The two trapped men were let go as they fell to their knees. Sansa ran out of the station, yelling to the people, "Run. Get out of here." Some people heeded his advice, logic outweighing their curiosity. Those who didn't leave were too curious for their own goods. They stared and pointed, and some had their phones out, filming. Izuku snarled in the faces of the crowd before reaching out a talon and scooping up 4 or 5 people. He slowly opened his mouth, unhinging his jaw. The people in his claws realized what he was doing before the rest of the crowd did, though it didn't take long for the crowd to realize too. The people squirmed, screaming in terror as he dropped them in his mouth, snapping his jaw shut at lightning speed. It took merely a second. He grew. Where he was 5 stories, it turned into 7 stories. Shouto and Hitoshi went after a few members of the crowd before they could run away. They happily gorged themselves, eating the hearts of multiple people, growing in size. Each of them were about the size of a 2-story building. People started screaming hysterically, scrambling away from the beasts. A few heroes came onto the scene. Izuku took care of them before they could even do anything. His form rippled, and he grew once more. They moved in the direction of downtown Musutafu, decimating the citizens in their path. They demolished building after building, wreaking havoc on the city. About 30 minutes into their onslaught, Shouto spotted something in the air heading towards them. He alerted Izuku, who looked over to his right. he saw what looked to be a winged creature. Izuku's eyes widened. He recognized the creature. It was the same type of creature that Izuku was. They landed a few meters away from the trio, and Izuku prompted them to speak. "Izuku, you need to come with me." Izuku blinked, then blinked again, and Mom. Inko just nodded before turning toward Hitoshi and Shadow. She tilted her head like a cat before waving her claws and gesturing them to follow. They all did. As they all took flight, Shadow, whose wings didn't come in until 15 minutes beforehand, wobbled a little before getting the hang of being in the air. They all followed Inko, who flew at practically lightning speed. Izuku kept up, though his boyfriends were half a second behind him. Once they reached the Musutafu forest, Inko suddenly dove and disappeared into the shadows. The four of them reappeared in a different forest. Izuku knew this because the types of trees were wildly different. They were large ancient trees, with vines hanging from each branch. In the treetops, there were houses. No, they were too large to be houses. Dens, then. They walked for about 10 minutes, until Inko led them into a clearing. There were dens circling the tree line, spreading out the further into the forest they went. Izuku turned his attention back to his mother, who was looking up at him. It made him really notice their height difference. She was about the size of a 4-story building, while Izuku was the size of a 15-story one. Both Shadow and Hitoshi were about half the size of Inko. Izuku's hearing picked up murmurs from around them, and his eyes turned in the direction of the noise. Dozens of creatures, similar to the likeness of the four of them, with a few distinguishing features, appeared from the surrounding dens. Inko let herself smile, as her subjects took in the sight that was her son. She took a good look at the other two Khans that were with him. One of them had magenta eyes and more gangly limbs than the other, who had mismatched eyes and longer teeth that jutted out from his lips. The two of them stood around Izuku protectively, as if he needed any extra protection. The gesture was clear though. The three of them were mates, no question about it. Inko stood at her full height, gathering her tribe's attention. "Today my son has started the revolution." She glanced up at her son, who just looked confused, yet she continued, "He revealed himself to the world in the past few days, and in that moment of confusion, Japan will be unable to retaliate. That is where each of us comes in. It will be the feast of the century." All the Khans roared, and Inko nudged her son to do the same. He roared, and it sounded throughout the forest for miles, shaking the roots of the trees. His two mates following along and, despite their size, the two let out roars that overtook her tribes. It seemed that the turn were more powerful than they looked. The crowd of Khans dispersed, some wandering around the clearing and back into the forest, and some wandering back into their dens. Izuku turned his head to look at her, before shrinking down to more her size. A Khan that was slightly smaller than Inko trotted over to them. They had a scar over their right eye, which was obviously blinded. Their forms shimmered in a metallic silver, their scales reflecting sunlight. As they stopped a meter from Inko, they crouched their forelegs into a bow. "Your Highness, welcome back," said a distinctly female voice. Inko nodded her head at the Khan. "General Vanira, it's good to be back. This is my son, Izuku." Vanira turned to look at Izuku, who didn't know what to do with himself. Vanira looked Izuku up and down. "Never in my life would I have thought I'd meet a Khanivore. It's an honor." She looked at the two smaller Khan as well, and his turnmates. "Amazing." Inko just smiled and gestured for all of them to follow her. "Come, we have much to talk about."